any rate of interest is a doubling time. You can take any rate of interest, and in a given number of years, that debt is going to double. And all financial debts grow exponentially in an upsweep. And economies cannot keep pace with this. Well, in America, they think, oh, the middle class is getting rich if they have a house because they're getting their house is worth more and more. But as houses are worth more and more, what do the younger people do? What do the children do? Well, for a number of years, I've been discussing my general theory with Global University, with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and for the 2 years that I was a professor at Peking University in economics. And before that, I'd made trips to China, to Wuhan, and to other university towns. And my common denominator of all of my discussions in China were how should Chinese students and government officials understand the economic dynamics that are at work within China's economy, and how does it interact with the world economy around it? Well, all my work in China has been to discuss how it can avoid falling into the debt trap and the financial oligarchy that has deindustrialized the United States and Western Europe. How does China avoid what's happened to America? You want to get the technology from America. You want what's good, but you don't want to end up polarizing an economy with a few billionaires running the economy and making money by impoverishing the rest of the economy. That's what you want to avoid. Why does the United States fear about China? That leads President Biden and the entire U.S. State Department and the Cold War establishment to single out China as the #1 enemy of America and its European satellites. What does China doing that upsets the West so much when China is so much more successful in its economic growth and its ability to raise labor out of poverty and into rising living standards all these years? Well, this book began when I was discussing with Qin Lao at the Global University for Sustainability. She asked me to give a set of lectures about the topics that she thought was most relevant for China. Basically, the theme of these lectures is, what's China's role in history at this point? We're seeing the whole world dividing into two different kinds of economies. And this is really an alternative to the economic dynamics that have destroyed the United States and the NATO countries. And you could say that these dynamics that are hurting the United States are a problem for Western civilization itself. What is wrong with the US and European system goes all the way back to Greece and Rome and how they became different from the whole rest of Asia, the whole rest of the world at that time. So how is China going to avoid this problem that's ground Western wage levels and living standards down instead of growing? And what is it that's concentrated all the economic growth and wealth in the United States and Europe in the hands of a sector that I call the FIRE sector: finance, insurance, and real estate, in the hands of the 1% of the population? In the America, 1%, maybe 5%, own by far most of the financial wealth, the stocks and the bonds and the bank deposits and all of the financial credit. And it's the financial wealth that controls the whole economy, just like after feudalism, it was the landlords that controlled the economy. So I've kept the sequence of questions that Qin Lao originally asked because the logic sort of followed in a practical way. It's normally I start at the beginning and I describe things in chronological order, but you can say that this book is my view of economic analysis of history with Chinese characteristics. So the question is, what makes industrial capitalism different from finance capitalism? And that really is the key to understanding the split that is in the world today between China and its allies on the one hand, and the United States and Europe on the other. Now, most people think that there's only one kind of capitalism, that capitalism is capitalism, and that's that. But what the United States have today is very different from what was progressive about industrial capitalism in the 19th century, the capitalism that Marx analyzed. Marx explained how industrial capitalism was revolutionary. Its aim was to make economies more efficient, and it wanted to free them from the legacy of feudalism. Industrial capitalism wanted to cut the cost of production to be more competitive in other countries. That was the key. How do you cut the cost of production? Well, you get rid of the landlord class. From the 11th century, 12th century onwards, the Roman papacy made a deal with the Norman warlords. There were tribes that came down from Northern Europe and conquered. And the Pope said, we will give you the blessing of divine right to conquer lands if you promise to become our feudal servant, our fiefdoms. And so you had the Normans conquer England in 1066. William the Conqueror conquered it and took over all the land. Robert Guiscard conquered southern Italy and Sicily, and other Normans already had conquered France. Well, the first thing that William the Conqueror did in England was to say, I want to have a listing of all of the land and how much rent we can charge. What does the land produce? How many crops are there? We say, we conquered you, and now you have to give everything you produce, all the surplus, to me, the king, and to my companions who conquered you. And that happened in every single European country. And these warlords became a hereditary class called the House of Lords, meaning the House of Landlords, who had conquered Europe. And they had they were absentee landlords. They charged rent for all the land, agricultural land, urban land, cities, and Europe had to pay an enormous amount of money just to the landlord class. And because it had to pay this money to the landlord class, this money was not available for capitalists to invest in factories and machinery and to hire labor. So the first way to become a more competitive economy, Adam Smith said, the physiocrats of France said, John Stuart Mill, the entire 19th century classical economic movement was, how do we get rid of landlords and how do we develop a way of calculating just how much rent there is so we make sure that that rent goes to the public sector, to the government, not to this landlord class we don't want. And to do that, they had to reform how parliaments were conducted. They had to reform elections. They had to make a whole different kind of political organization. Well, there was one other problem besides landlords, and that was a banking class. After about the 15th century, the landlord rulers, the kings, all went to war with each other to try to get more land. And the wars were so expensive that they had to borrow money. Now, since Christianity was formed, from the very beginning, it had opposed charging interest, all of the church councils. But all of a sudden, it was the papacy itself, the church, that promoted the charging of interest in order to have the warlords go to war and give the money to the church. That was sort of what happened. And so the papacy blessed the Christian banking class. Well, the first thing that Christian bankers had to do, they were called Lombards from northern Italian towns, or Cahorsines from Cahors in across the Alps in southern France. The first thing that they did was drive out the Jewish moneylenders. Before the 12th century, there was, of course, credit. People would lend money, but most of this was not considered a good thing to do. It was anti-Christian. And you had people on the edges of society make loans. You had Jewish people make loans, you had non-Christian make loans, or you had very badly behaving Christians make loans. Well, all of a sudden, once loans were made to wage war and to grab other lands and conquer lands to get their rent, you had the creditors come from the very highest families. And so some of the wealthiest Christian merchants developed banking, and like the Medici in Florence. And the Medici became bankers, the House of Medici, and supplied 4 popes. And you had in every country, the wealthiest banking class took over the government. The Fuggers in Germany became wealthy, and their family became the nobility. In England, there was a Christian creditor, Walter de la Pole, and his family all became money. And so the governments became run by the financial class, and they worked hand in hand with the landlord class, and they charged money. And just as land rent lowered the amount of money that the economy had, this banking class charged interest, and banks would make loans to countries, to governments. The governments couldn't pay. What did the bankers say? They said, all right, give us your mine, your mineral rights, give us your land as collateral. Why don't you create public utilities and let us turn these public utilities into monopolies? Give us trading rights for trading monopolies. Give us your transportation. So you had sort of what ended up with Margaret Thatcher in England. You had the banking class taking over the role of government. And by the 19th century, the governments of Europe and also the United States were run both by the landlord class in the House of Lords and by the banking class. And Marx described capitalism as saying they have to get rid of the fact that these bankers are not trying to make the economy grow. They're trying to do what the International Monetary Fund does today. They want the economy to be so poor that it runs even deeper into debt and has to give more of the public domain to the creditor class until the bankers become the government. And so Marx said, well, this is not how industrial capitalism can succeed. If you want industrial capitalism to have an economy that is free from land rent and free from interest, you have to industrialize banking and finance. And he expected that to be the destiny of industrial capitalism. And indeed, it seemed to be the destiny in Germany. Germany was using banking to actually finance industry, the steel industry, largely through the military and shipbuilding and arms industry. The financial class worked with the government together. But that didn't happen in England or the United States, that had the financial class pretty much running the government. So you realize that Europe began to be running into a problem. It still had the ideal of socialism. In the United States, the business schools said, we've got to help America catch up to Europe. How do we catch up to Europe? Well, actually, the United States did very much what China is doing today. It said the first thing we have to do is we realize there has to be a mixed economy. Of course, we need private initiative to develop new industrial products, to develop marketing, but there are certain things that belong in the public sector, and they're natural monopolies. For instance, public health. We want to provide public health freely. Education. We want to keep education free so that everybody can be educated to become more productive and healthy to become more productive. And we want to keep certain things, activities in the public domain, like transportation. We want inexpensive transportation, communications, all of the things that were in the public domain around a century ago when World War I broke out. And so the idea, Simon Patton said, government infrastructure is like a fourth category of economics. Unlike labor and capital and land, they're all seeking to get more income. But the government sector isn't there to try to make a profit. The government sector is to provide natural monopolies and public needs, basic needs, at a low cost or subsidized or freely, in order that if you give free education and free health, then you're not going to have your labor force pay its wages to repay the cost of going to school and getting an education. And you won't have to have labor pay for the cost of medical care because that'll be free. And therefore, labor will be less expensive in the United States than it is in privatized countries. And that is what made the United States such a low-cost country that it was able to outcompete with Europe. And by the 1920s, the United States had taken over the leadership of industrialism by being a mixed economy. And people called this socialism. And indeed, the leading parties in Europe were called social democratic parties or labor parties. It seemed that everybody saw that you needed a mixed economy, and Europe seemed to have a chance of doing what China was doing. And that was the logic of industrial capitalism. Well, China has rediscovered this basic mixed economy approach simply by thinking what's practical. In China, you didn't set out to say, how did America develop? Because it's not something that is taught in the schools in the West anymore. You decided what is socialism. And what Marx said is that the destiny of industrial capitalism was to evolve into socialism because socialism provided basic needs at a lower price than capitalism did. You want to ultimately provide everything that people need, land, housing, a job, an education, public services. You want to provide these freely so that the labor will end up with more free time, with higher living standards. It won't have to work as many days or as many hours a day. It will be able to improve its living standards. And China has done one thing that the classical economists wanted to do in the 19th century, but never quite did. They said a free market is a market free of landlords and free of bankers and monopolists. But neither the United States nor Europe ever got finance free of bankers. In fact, in 1913, just before World War I, the bankers in the United States took control of the banking into a new organization, the Federal Reserve. They took the power of money creation and credit out of the hands of the Treasury and the government into the hands of Wall Street and Philadelphia and Boston, Chicago, other financial centers. The result is that instead of following the logic of industrial capitalism, America and Europe became something else. And that was finance capitalism. And the result of this financialization of economic rent and monopolies over the last 100 years has polarized the Western economies and has left them uncompetitive with China. Why did so many American firms after 1990 move to China? Why did so many Western corporations say, we don't want to hire American or European labor anymore? Let's move to China. Well, that's because the Western labor had to pay so much money for its housing, so much money for its health care, so much money to privatized monopolists that they couldn't compete. And they hoped that China would become as decadent as America at some point, but it would just have low-priced labor. Well, China had different ideas. It didn't follow the American plan, fortunately. It kept banking and finance in the public domain. How do we provide the money for what China needs? That's not the question they ask in the United States. They say, how can we make money to take over corporations and essentially make them pay dividends and make money off them financially instead of industrially? Well, the result is that financialized economies in the West slow down. Any rate of interest is a doubling time. You can take any rate of interest, and in a given number of years, that debt is going to double. And all financial debts grow exponentially in an upsweep. And economies cannot keep pace with this. So in the West, more and more wages, more and more corporate profits, and more tax revenue is paid to the creditors, to the banks, and to the bondholders. And the more money that you pay the creditors, the less you have to invest in new factories, plant and equipment, and machinery, or research and development. In the United States and England, 80% of bank lending takes the form of real estate mortgages. And as the amount of credit goes up, there's more and more ability of credit to lend out to buyers. And so if 80% of this rising accumulation of financial wealth grows, then it's going to all become lent to buyers of housing, and the housing prices go up and up and up. Well, in America, they think, oh, the middle class is getting rich if they have a house because they're getting their house is worth more and more. But as houses are worth more and more, what do the younger people do? What do the children do? They say, well, if we want a house, we're going to have to pay more and more of our income for the house. And if we want an education, we're going to have to pay 10 times as much for our education today as our family did. And we're going to have to go into debt. It costs $50,000 a year to get an education at a good university, a graduate university in the United States. Well, you can imagine if you have to pay $50,000 a year over time at interest rates that increase the overall money, well, you're going to have to pay $500,000 just to get an education. Well, if Chinese students can get an education for free, they'll have this equivalent of $500,000 that they don't have to pay to the banks for a loan. They can afford to buy the goods and services you produce. You can buy nicer housing, you can buy cars, you can buy furniture, you can have enough savings so that you don't have to worry that if you lose your job or you get sick, you won't get in trouble. Well, that in the United States, they don't have that fortunate position. Socialist economies are more competitive than capitalist economies. And if Marx had been right in what he expected, he was an optimist. He thought that industrial capitalism would evolve into socialism. And if that were the case, then the Western world would be very competitive. But instead, it's the Western world has evolved into finance capitalism, not socialism. And that's why the West treats China as a threat. The financialized economies run by the financial sector as the head of governments have always feared that a socialism will take away their free lunch, take away their ability just to live off the bonds and the stocks and the housing and the property that they inherited to become a class very much like the class that the 19th century classical economists wanted to get rid of and to free economies from. So instead of becoming a free market, classical style, free from rentier, rent-seeking class, the West has become a market free for the financial class, for the landlord class, for the fire sector to exploit the rest of the economy and charge whatever it wants. And this difference is what makes China's economy so different from that of the United States, and also so much more successful in raising its living standards.